in a foolish moment, I had actually committed, I see now, for opening remarks of 45 minutes, but that would be rude to the people who are here for the first session, all of whom are present. But I'll still have a brief separation between my opening remarks, such as there are, and then introducing the chair of the session, my esteemed colleague and dear friend, the Chief Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, who also has rearranged his schedule to be here today. He is a very sought-after person in G20 circles, in domestic circles, so I'm very grateful to that. So there's no need for a summary of what happened yesterday, because that was admirably done by Kapil. So, but just as a kind of refresher, curtain raiser, I thought I would spend 2 or 3, well, maybe 5 minutes, linking this to some of the comments in the one-page handout that was in your packets. So let me first start by thanking those discussion leaders, particularly those who made PowerPoints, for the obvious work that went into those. And I think the whole standard of the conference and the discussion reflected the kind of input that had been made. I had asked the organizers whether we could reshuffle the nameplates, Anna, so that everybody could be closer. I don't see that that's happened. I would still say that if you know who is not coming, could you just help bring, as it were, the famous 40 closer, and then have those who are other participants at the, at the front end. There's a certain amount of anxiety that arises if you see acres of empty space ahead of you. All right. Paul, Peter, Santiago is here. I don't know whether Ottaviano and Poonam. Anyway, so there's no formality associated with it. Okay, so firstly, thanks to all of those who put in the hard work. Second, the framework within which I approach this as the vice chairman of NITI Aayog is India's journey to becoming a developed economy by 2047. There were references to that. And so I think a frame for the way in which I was listening to the conversation yesterday is, what does India need from the world for its own transformation? And if India succeeds in its transformation, what does it mean for the rest of the world? So I think that's the 25-year perspective, and I don't think it's inappropriate for me to share with this group the formulation of my boss, the Honorable Prime Minister, which is that at a moment between the late 20s and 1947, in 25 years, the prospect of Indian independence went from a remote possibility to a reality. And so the challenge that the Prime Minister has put before the nation, and indirectly before me, is how to use the next 25 years to describe that trajectory. And many people here have past associations and perhaps present associations with the World Bank. Incidentally, people at the end there, feel free to move forward because you are participants as well, is so the challenge, therefore, is, I was going to say about the World Bank that somewhere, it may have been in the Growth Commission or elsewhere, the actual track record of countries, and Santiago is here, and I think Latin America is a case in point, that actually breasting the tape, going from lower middle income, certainly to higher income, but certainly to advanced, is a very difficult journey. And Homi Kharas, who was here online yesterday, is credited with having provided the formulation of the middle income trap. And there's been a lot of debate about whether there's a middle income trap or no middle income trap. But the larger point is that achieving the Prime Minister's goals in those 25 years is a massive challenge. And as we've already seen, whatever precedents there were are impacted by a less favorable global environment. So it's in that context that processing what happened yesterday, that was how I was achieving these inputs. And I think various points stick out, and then I'll turn to the chair of the next session. But I think the first point, was it either Albert or Paul, I forget, that we really are at an epoch transition in the location of the global economy and society. So that has to be reflected in global governance, and we're finding that difficult. Second, I think what was very evident is that we continue to be in a world of nation states. We do not have a machinery for global governance. Now, at the time of US hegemony post Second World War, treaty-based international institutions, including the UN, were created, and they were meant to be a surrogate for global governance after the failure of the League of Nations. But what we're seeing now was all of that worked if there was an implicit carve-out for certainly the US and to some extent the G7. They really, in that sense, were not universal institutions, and one case in point was Nixon unilaterally abandoning Bretton Woods for domestic political reasons. So those are the realities that even though there's lip service to global public goods, as recently as yesterday, just reading this morning's papers, I read that the climate ministerial was not able to reach any conclusion because there was no agreement on burden sharing. So that's the world we're in. And the issue is, should we despair? What kind of role do middle powers like India, but which is expected to be on a trajectory from being the fifth largest to the third largest economy, what contribution and role should they play? And how do we give substance to the commitment of the G20 to robust or strong, sustainable, balanced, and inclusive growth? And I think what Homi and others had to say yesterday, Robert more than Homi, about the penalties of not paying attention to the inclusive part is a very important takeaway for all of us, and I would say is baked into the development vision that our Prime Minister has. We have a phrase in Hindi, sabka saath, sabka vishwas, sorry, vikas, sabka prayas is also part of that, or yeah, yeah, no, they've okay. But the point is, no one left behind. And then we have to ask about whether this is at a domestic level, whether it's a global level. So, we today will be talking in the remaining sessions about the geopolitics of global governance, and most importantly, and the last is by no means the least, talking about inclusion in an uncertain world. So that's the link between what happened yesterday and what happened today, and I won't prattle on. At this point, I move to my role as MC and would like to introduce the chairperson of this panel. And Anantha, you weren't here yesterday, but we don't spend a lot of time on introductions, but essentially you call upon your speakers in whatever sequence you've agreed, and if you wish to frame the goals of the session, you're welcome to do so. So, as I already mentioned, Dr. Anantha Nageswaran is Chief Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, and prior to this appointment, he has worked as a writer, author, teacher, and consultant, taught at various business schools and institutes of management in India and in Singapore, and has published extensively both scholarly articles and is very prominent in the business press. He was Dean of the IFMR Graduate School of Business and a distinguished visiting professor of economics at Priya University. Both of these are in South India, and has also been a part-time member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India from 2019 to 2021, and we will follow the same drill as yesterday, a series of discussion leads. I don't believe that they are presentations. Then Q&A amongst what remains of the famous 40. Then we would have, at the option of the chair, either Q&A, either responses for the panel, or we'll bring in the expert, who is my distinguished colleague and member, NITI Aayog, Ramesh Chand. And then if there's time, we'll invite some questions from the floor. With that, Anant, thank you for making it convenient to be here. Over to you.
Thank you, Suman. Good morning, everybody. I must commend NITI Aayog for putting this topic on the agenda: multilateralism, geopolitics, governance, and the global commons. In fact, we all know it's a truism that there is no politics without economics, and there is no economics without politics, and there is no multilateralism without taking geopolitics into consideration. We know that multilateralism flourished and after the end of the World War II. There were attempts to create multilateral institutions in the aftermath of World War I as well, but that met with little success. In fact, if we analyze the causes for multilateralism to take off and flourish after World War II, but not after World War I, we might in fact be able to understand some of the reasons as to why it is currently floundering. In fact, at the end of World War I, the kind of obligations and reparations imposed on Germany created the preconditions for the emergence of World War II, indeed. So are we in one such situation now? Because post-World War II, the victors, although the camp split immediately after the end of War II, the victors were able to take an attitude of enlightened self-interest and combined with magnanimity, were able to create several institutions that stood the test of time for several decades. They have currently come under strain. In fact, we are having this discussion within a week or two of two important books having been released, one by Neil Hove, who along with William Strauss co-wrote The Fourth Turning, and another book by Peter Turchin, both of which have been reviewed by Francis Fukuyama for New York Times. So is this an inevitable part of the cycle that nations and globe itself goes through? In other words, do things have to get worse before they get better? Alternatively, in order to make sure that multilateralism works in the interest of global commons and global public goods, for example, do we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Global Commons, similar to what South Africa did at its independence, on topics such as global warming and pandemic prevention? Therefore, should the topic of this session be, how has geopolitics affected multilateralism and the governance of multilateral institutions? How far and how much has it come in the way of the provision of global commons and global public goods? So I would rephrase the title and convert them into two specific questions for my panelists to address. Of course, I didn't share these questions with them before, so it is unfair to expect that their prepared remarks would address these, but maybe the ensuing discussions can focus on these two aspects. So with that preamble, it is my great pleasure to invite the first speaker, Ms. Mary Pangetsu, former Managing Director of the World Bank from Indonesia. She was former Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnerships. She possesses extensive expertise in international trade, investment, and development. As Indonesia's Minister of Trade and Tourism, she had contributed significantly to policy making. Additionally, she served as a senior fellow and professor at various prestigious academic institutions. So each of the panelists will speak for about 12 minutes, and I will then throw the floor open. In case I have a question or two to ask, I will ask them at the end of their remarks, and then I will throw the floor open for questions and discussions, at the end of which I will invite the expert, Dr. Ramesh, to share his remarks, and then let's take it from there depending on the time availability. So with that, it's my pleasure to invite Ms. Mary Pangetsu to make her opening remarks. Each of them have 12 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Namaste. Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy and it's a great honor to be here at this very important meeting happening at a very important juncture in the India G20 process. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm afraid you're going to have to look at me instead of the PowerPoint. I'd like to make 3 points in my remarks. First, why multilateralism and maintaining the global economic order is still key, given all the challenges we have. And second, what is the kind of multilateralism and global economic order we need to have? And finally, what it means for the institutions and multilateral institutions and processes, including regional institutions and processes that we have now. So that's kind of the recommendation part of it. So let me start with why multilateralism and maintaining the global economic order is important. I think it's very clear from all that we discussed yesterday that the global economic order is at risk of becoming frayed and dysfunctional because of many reasons. One is the decline in US leadership and the shift in hegemonic interests and domestic constituents. I think populism, the rise of populism was mentioned yesterday, which makes the US less willing or capable to lead the public good outcome of the previous global economic order of an open and rules-based economic order. You have the China-US competition and geopolitical tensions leading to new divisions. And you have, yesterday we had a number of presentations which showed the structural changes in the world, and we are moving from a unipolar to a multipolar world of economic power with a clear emergence of developing economies. And this is why the discussion about Global South in the G20 year of India becomes very relevant. Second, given this threat and the global challenges that we face, we need multilateralism even more than ever. Multilateralism, I would say, is the prerequisite to managing the transition from a unipolar world to a stable multipolar new order. Not a US bloc of friends or allies and friends, not a China bloc, and neither, I would say, a Global South bloc. It has to be a bloc that is pursuing agreed shared principles and rules. And we still need rules and norms to stop free riding and bad behavior. I mean, the whole global economic order and rules-based and so on was intended to stop bad behavior or constrain bad behavior by members and also the leader. Now we are seeing, obviously, the rise of protectionism and rules of the WTO, like non-discrimination and so on, being violated, and leading to beggar thy neighbor policies. Yesterday we had lots of comments on the US industrial policy and how it really does break the WTO rules and leads to provoking action by others. So multilateralism is also needed to address the global common challenge, whether it's climate, health, or I would argue that, because G20 is about growth, the slow growth trajectory that we are facing today and how much that's hurting developing countries. And I would argue that trade and investment is still a crucial part of that growth story. Okay, so secondly, what kind of global economic order do we want? I think we want one that continues to deliver not just growth, but sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development. I think that's a wide agreement on that. And peace. You know, the original way it was termed in global public goods was growth and peace, but I think it's about sustainable development. And it is about being resilient enough to manage global risks and disruptive technological innovations. I think we heard a lot about that yesterday. It's climate, it's technology, and I would say the debt crisis, energy and food security, and finally, cohesive enough to manage systemic crisis. I mean, we learned a lot about that during the pandemic and now as we face the climate crisis. So what kind of multilateralism and multilateral institutions are going to be fit for purpose given that current context that I tried to describe to you? And I think yesterday everybody reminded us, including Subramaniam ji, that we have to take given the current situation, which is the security concerns and the geopolitics. The ongoing US-China geopolitics is not going to go away anytime soon, and the social and political conditions that are facing countries. So we have to take that as a given. So I think this is really the starting point, and I think it's about multilateralism and open regionalism and international openness, which is essential to secure sustainable development and peace. That's really my main message. Now let's have a bit of a discussion about what that means. Moving forward, what does that mean for the governance and different multilateral and regional institutions? I think multilateralism and international cooperation to address shared global challenges relative to traditional and non-traditional security challenges is going to be important. And there's opportunity to cooperate based on shared interests. And I'm an optimist. Many are very pessimistic about multilateralism, but I'm a diehard multilateralism and probably an optimistic diehard multilateralist. I look at a half glass full, and I believe that while many things didn't work in the multilateral and global economic order, it's not about breaking down finding a new order or breaking down the institutions, but it's about building, evolving the existing institutions and processes. That's kind of my main message. And at the end of the day, if you look at what's happened in the last 8 decades, I use the word concerted unilateralism, because at the end of the day, you do sign on the WTO agreement, but what happens is countries are the ones that do the action. We signed up to Paris, but it's countries that do the action. So some are binding, like the WTO, some are not binding. But it's about getting the international cooperation, the international discussion and dialogue and the conversation to agree on what we need to do and how we need to get there, and give the confidence. Confidence comes from others doing it. Confidence comes from capacity building. Confidence comes from not just the promise and pledges of resources, but real resources coming through if you did what you were agreed to do. And I think the other dimension, which we didn't really talk about, we talked about it a little bit yesterday. In the new multilateralism, it's not just state to state, but there's the private sector. The technology story was very clearly a private sector issue, and self-governance also in the private sector, and how to incorporate the society. So I think to go to the multipolar world and seeing how can we move forward without the US leadership accounting for the geopolitics. It's about the shared interests of the global south, of the middle powers, who are outside of the bipolar world. And I think our shared interest is still about open trade and investment. It's about navigating and managing the bifurcation between US and China. I mean, yesterday, very powerful presentations about the costs of decoupling. If you actually had total decoupling, the cost is very high. And guess who pays? It's the developing countries that will pay. What emerges in this whole decoupling, or it's now softened to de-risking, accounting for security concerns. We see economic instruments being used. How can we manage that, or at least constrain that, so that the damage is minimized? To put it the first best is not to have all this happen. But let's face it, the reality is there. So second best, how do we minimize the damage? And then there's this big, the other shared interest, I would say, is the green transition. I mean, yesterday's discussion was a powerful, wholehearted support for green transition coming from developing countries. And I think that's the big shift in the last few years, where developing countries were saying, no, climate is a luxury. We don't have the resources. We want to focus on growth. I think that whole debate has totally changed. Having been very involved in this in the last 3 years, I think the whole debate has changed. But developing countries are asking, okay, we now see that we need to address climate, otherwise we will not develop, but we need resources, we need technology, and so on. So the idea is not to create a new order or institution, but reform, evolve, and strengthen, and continue to agree on principles, norms, and standards. And what you need to have happen is a multi-pronged approach to building the existing systems. So I'm going to focus on trade, because that's kind of my area of knowledge and expertise. And yesterday, our G20 Sherpa, Amitabh Khan, mentioned that the resilience of global value chains, facilitating investment, unlocking ICT, and pushing back on protectionism, WTO reforms, including dispute resolution, were key in the G20 agenda. And I think Subramaniam also mentioned that India will be hurt if in its green transition if it is not integrated with the world economy. I'm quoting you from yesterday. So I think we all believe that this is key and this is important. So what does it mean for the processes and the institutions that we have? And I'll start with G20. G20 hopefully can overcome, since 2016, G20 has been somewhat absorbed in communique language. During Trump years, it was taking everything that said multilateral out. Now we know paragraph 3 and 4 is about war, right? So unfortunately, it's very unfortunate, but we hopefully we can rise above that and go into the substance. G20 is about agreeing at the political will of what needs to be done collectively. What are the principles, norms, and standards? And then it's taken normally elsewhere to negotiate, whether it's the other WTO or other fora, or the G20 actually acts on it, like the concerted fiscal stimulus in response to the global financial crisis. So I do think G20, especially with including the Global South in there, is key. Well, how do you give the Global South a voice? Let me share with you 3 thoughts. Global South can be at the table, and some of them are at the table in G20, or they could be represented at the table. For instance, Indonesia represents ASEAN, and we always get ASEAN to be invited as an observer. Even if you're not at the table, can you observe? Yeah? So these are just, instead of just, G21 is not the only answer. That's what I'm trying to say. So I think I've run out of time, so I couldn't get into some of the ideas, but let me just, I had some comments on climate and development, but I'll reserve that for the question and answer. Let me just focus on trade very briefly. I think it should be a multi-pronged strategy. WTO reforms, yes, focusing on the dispute settlement to begin with, because I think that's very important for the Global South. And you can also think about other important areas such as plurilateral initiatives, or what we call Club of Clubs initiatives. There's one that's called MPIA, Multi-Party Interim Appeal Arbitration, which is involving 53 countries. It includes China, Japan, EU, and Australia. It's basically continuing the appeal process, but not within the WTO, but using exactly, mirroring exactly that. So it's basically what I say, keep the bicycle moving in terms of having open, rules-based, inclusive trade happen. And I mentioned this yesterday, the security clause. How can we codify the grounds for using security in restricting trade? And it's going to spill over into defining the criticality of goods that you can use trade restrictions or temporary bans and so on and so forth. And finally, outside of the WTO, the Club of Clubs can be on a thematic basis, like what's happening in services, e-commerce, and digital. And even if the US is not there, you can continue. And I would say regional trade agreements is the other route that I would really push strongly. And here, I think you mentioned it yesterday also, deep regional trade agreements. So what doesn't happen in the multilateral system can continue to happen in the regional trade agreements. So deeper regional trade agreements, which will include competition policy, given what's happened with the big technology companies, services, labor and environment, and I would say trade and climate is another dimension within the multilateral as well as the regional that can also be addressed. And partnerships. All of the Asian agreements have partnership in there, regional comprehensive partnership agreements, because it's about capacity building and working with different levels of development, but truly real capacity building combined, hopefully, with financial and technology support to make that happen. And so my final call is we did have this paragraph, I think a couple of years back. I think I would try to find that paragraph and revive it. It basically says, the G20 countries support a rules-based multilateral trading system, but also supports regional or pathways or different pathways to achieve this, but in an open and inclusive way, right? So it's about open regionalism and making sure you are open. Even plurilateral agreements need to be inclusive, allowing observers who have not actually signed up to actually be included in the discussions. Let me close there. I apologize for taking 1 or 2 minutes longer.
Thank you very much, ma'am. That was a very comprehensive list of issues that you raised. Just wanted to leave a thought with you you may come back to it later, not immediately. You said plurilateral institutions and Club of Clubs could be one way, but will they facilitate or run counter to multilateralism? That's one question that I had for you. And you also spoke earlier in your remarks about norms and rules to prevent free riding. So what could they be such that multilateralism is not hampered? So these are the 2 questions I wanted to leave with you. I'm going to take a small deviation from the order in which the discussion leaders have been mentioned. I'm going to take the liberty of asking Ram Madhav ji to come last because it is not the least. Geopolitics is important, and without geopolitics, we don't move forward on multilateralism, especially in the current context. So I want his remarks to be the final word, if I may say so. So in that sense, so I'm going to now request Mr. John Louis Arkan, President Global Development Network, to take the floor for the benefit of the assembled guests here. He is a Canadian economist and professor of economics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, as well as an affiliate professor at the Université Mohammed VI Polytechnic in Rabat. He is a founding fellow of the European Development Research Network. He has previously taught at the University of Montreal and has been a visiting professor at various universities. Mr. John Louis Arkan, the floor is yours.
May I just thank Jean-Louis? There were the hiccup in getting Donald Kaberuka to be present. He'd been committed, but there were logistical problems. And at the last moment, Jean-Louis has volunteered. Thank you, Jean-Louis.
My pleasure, and it's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I am not Donald Kaberuka. The only thing we share is that I happen to have been born in Africa just like him. I'm born in the Cameroon. I'm going to talk in the context of this session 5 on health and vulnerability, something which has been patently absent from what we've talked about over the past day. Perhaps, in some sense, it's sort of we're all tired of dealing with health issues after COVID. It's sort of like our British friends with Brexit; they just don't want to talk about it anymore. But at some point, you know, I think especially in the context of G20, we do have to talk about health, vulnerability, what the G20 can do about this, and the link that it has to the global South. And I'm going to have a very simple structure to this presentation. And basically, I'm going to make 3 arguments. When health involves positive externalities, multilateralism and sort of the global system, global governance seems to have no trouble handling it, or relatively little trouble handling it. You know, these are sort of no-brainer gains. That's the first point. And I'll give 3 examples that where actually I've worked on, so I can actually say something intelligent about these examples. But there are many more, and a lot of people in the room could come up with other examples. Then the second point is going to be vulnerability to losses, and I'm going to take the example actually of COVID, but not in the way you expect. Okay? Not in sort of medical terms per se, not in terms of like vaccine nationalism, but actually the economic costs of COVID to the global South, and this is going to link up to what Mari started to say before me. And in some sense, this is why I put this as, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We have a lot of good intentions with respect to this, and in terms of the G20 countries, and especially the global North with respect to the global South, and maybe there's something that we can do about this. And then I'm going to conclude by trying to be a little bit more provocative in terms of G20 and the SDGs. I think then that'll allow Ram to sort of meld into the geopolitics. So let me take the 3 examples. So just for the economists in the room, not everyone, thank God, is an economist in this room, but for economists in the room, the conceptual framework that economists use to think about health and development is what's known as the Grossman model, where basically health is both something which goes into the utility function and it's an investment. It's both a consumption good and it's an investment. So we value health because it makes people more productive. That's on the one hand. Right? And on the other hand, it's also a consumption good in and of itself. And so when we look at at health, we look at indicators. We're not just interested, if we have some sort of intervention, and the examples I'm going to give are universal health coverage. That's a big one on the global stage. I've spent the past 15 years in Geneva, so I know a hell of a lot of people at the WHO, and this is the stuff they talk about all the time. That's what UHC is. Malaria eradication is another example of this, and then introductions of various types of vaccines. There's a novel TB vaccine which is going to start being introduced starting in 2028. All of these things, they have fairly good cost-benefit ratios. Sometimes the effect on growth is relatively small, but even if the effect on growth is relatively small, the effect on, again, the metric that people use in health, which are DALYs, disability-adjusted life years, or QALYs, quality-adjusted life years, or lives saved, deaths averted. The payoffs to these interventions are high, and the multilateral institutions exist to take care of these problems, right? I mean, we have institutions such as the WHO, sort of at the global level, and then we have sort of more specialized institutions such as Gavi or the Global Fund, to basically to coordinate action on these global goods. So here's a typical example: UHC. This is work that I did with some colleagues at WHO. UHC, universal health coverage. So this is going in, for basically childhood diseases, non-communicable diseases, TB, HIV/AIDS, and I'm just contrasting here India and China, the sort of estimates that one get. You see, you don't get huge impacts, it turns out, of these interventions in terms of GDP, in terms of growth, and this is really what we're talking about in terms of sustainable growth, right? People are healthier. On the other hand, in terms of averted deaths, for a country like India, moving to UHC will avert an awful lot of deaths. Okay, so that's one example. And these are no-brainers, right? I mean, this is stuff where, depending upon how you value the things, these are investments that should be made. And there's a global will to do this sort of thing. Second example, malaria. Okay? Malaria, I mean, this is even malaria, there's a whole literature on this. Malaria is another one of these things where global eradication is possible. We've made a lot of progress on this. It also happens to be pro-poor. It shifts basically the income distribution of endemic countries, shifts the PDF, the probability density function, to the right? So, and it's basically a pro-poor intervention. Again, a no-brainer. Or a third one, novel tuberculosis vaccine. Okay? These novel tuberculosis vaccine, particularly it'll be Southeast Asia, which will benefit from the introduction of the novel tuberculosis vaccine. Also, big gains in India and big gains in Russia for various reasons I'm not going to go into. But again, these are examples of global goods where the multilateral system will help us adopt these interventions, and these are no-brainers, very easy. Okay. Now let's look at the flip side. The flip side and COVID. The problem here is what we have is basically permanent impacts of transitory shocks. Okay? And the problem with COVID, and I'm not talking again about the vaccine per se, the problem with COVID is what happened in the global north. What happened in the global north is that we had shutdowns. Okay? We had shutdowns for very good reasons. There's a whole literature on this. Our friends at Imperial College did all sorts of, SIR models on, at least people like me in the economics profession, we suddenly discovered epidemiology, right? When COVID struck, right? And we discovered all of this terminology, and we found out what our colleagues had been doing for years. And we found out we could actually read their stuff. The point is, we had shutdowns. What did shutdowns do in the global north? In OECD countries, let's say OECD plus China, right? What did they do? They led to massive recessions. Okay? Massive recessions. If you look at something, I'll come back to that thing in a second. If you look at the massive recessions that we had in the global north, we basically had roughly an 8 percentage point drop. We can argue about the actual number of percentage points. 8 percentage point drop in growth in the global north. Okay. What happened then through, and this is where this links up to what Mari was saying. What happened then in the global south? And in particular, I'm going to focus on sub-Saharan Africa because I happen to have a strong link to sub-Saharan Africa. What happened in sub-Saharan Africa? This recession in the global north was transmitted to sub-Saharan Africa. The sort of estimates that you get for sub-Saharan Africa is that roughly 4 percentage points of growth were shaved off just through the recessions caused by lockdowns in the global north to sub-Saharan Africa. And the transmission mechanism through trade, there are other transmission mechanisms, but trade, it's particularly countries that were open to trade in sub-Saharan Africa which got hit. Okay? The graph that you have up here is simply, there are various ways in which you can do this. You can do this econometrically. This is just sort of basically back of the envelope calculation based on IMF World Economic Outlook, right? And what they had in terms of predictions for growth in Africa. And then that was in 2019, like in November 2019. Then you look in April 2021, and you look at what actually happened, right, or what they were predicting was going to happen, right, after COVID, and you can see the hit, okay? So that's the second part of the mechanism. What's the third part of the mechanism? The third part of the mechanism is this picture, and that is severe recessions in the global south, and in particular, and it's actually worse in sub-Saharan Africa with respect to other parts of the global south, severe recessions kill people. Okay, so what you have on the left-hand side here, these are like this is controlling for a truckload of stuff. I'm not going to get into the econometrics, okay? But this is sort of like, there's a whole literature on the pro-cyclicality or counter-cyclicality of health and GDP. In the north, okay, tends to be counter-cyclical, right? But it's the opposite in developing countries. And in particular, what we have on the left-hand side in this picture here is the crude death rate. On the right-hand picture, it's basically it's infant mortality, 0.5 mortality. And severe recessions, controlling for levels, okay? So controlling for the level of GDP per capita, severe recessions kill people, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Positive growth, strong growth, doesn't actually reduce mortality. That's why when you see in these pictures, you can sort of see that 95% confidence bands, it's flat to the right, okay? So when you do the back of the envelope, and you can do this with a linear specification, you get the same sort of result, okay? When you do a back of the envelope calculation and you put sort of all the numbers together, the sort of number that you get for the actual cost of COVID, just to sub-Saharan Africa, okay, because of shutdowns in the global north, is that you have roughly 500,000 people were killed, okay? So you're basically transferring deaths from the global north to the global south. Now, I'm not saying that there shouldn't have been, I'm not a denialist saying we shouldn't have done, there shouldn't have been shutdowns in the global north. That's not the point. But the point is, this is something which is not taken into account in any way, shape, or form by the international community. And there are lots of examples like this where you have spillovers from policies in the global north on countries in the global south. And this is where we need some kind of insurance mechanism. Okay? And in terms of what the G20 can do, I mean, one thing that I would call for essentially would be for ODA, and there are a lot of people who've called for this, ODA, Overseas Development, Official Development Assistance, which, for example, for sub-Saharan Africa, has been declining over the past 10 years. It's been going down, 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 down. Right? ODA, again, let me be provocative here. ODA is not something which is going to spur growth. But on the other hand, it can be a very effective insurance mechanism, and it has to be counter-cyclical. Okay, so there's a little bit left, but that's a role that it can play. And let me conclude by being, this is something I get in trouble in Geneva for saying, okay, and you'll understand why. So let me call on the G20 to put forward an NPT, a non-proliferation treaty on SDGs. We have 169 targets and 247 indicators. Who can make policy with 247 indicators to try to address, right? I mean, this is absurd, okay? And I know I will get in trouble with the UN crowd here, okay? Who can be against motherhood? That's another way of putting it, right? And in some sense, sort of standard, and let me sort of cite Mansur Olson, right? The logic of collective action. You have a smaller group. That smaller group, which is G20, in contrast with the UN, should be able to focus not on 247 indicators, right? And probably sustainable growth is something tangible that G20 can actually do something about, right? It's tight. India can push this agenda, but I would just ask you to add one little codicil to this, which is so important for the world's poorest countries. Call it Sub-Saharan Africa, call it, it could be LDC category. Some of us were in Doha, for the LDC summit. But let's add an insurance mechanism for the poorest countries in the world. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, John Larkand. It was a very good presentation. What I took away personally were two things. In the very beginning, you said good health may not necessarily mean good economic outcome, but definitely bad health leads to bad economic outcomes. And later on, you also said, while growth doesn't influence mortality, recessions kill. So there is an interesting asymmetry in this, and public policy is all about asymmetry rather than linear relationships on either side. And I think that should also be part of how we look at multilateralism and the G20. We may not be able to create good multilateral outcomes just by having G20, but not having it may create to even worse fragmentation. So I think that is there is a basis here to start with G20. So and then your last comment about trying to be all things to all people with SDG goals and indicators doesn't necessarily mean good outcomes for sustainable development goals. So much to ponder about. Thank you very much. I now invite Sri Ram Madhav ji to take the floor, and for the benefit of the audience here, Sri Ram Madhav ji is an Indian politician, social leader, author, and thinker. Dr. Ram Madhav has curated significant global initiatives for India Foundation, served as the National General Secretary of the Bharatiya Janata Party, overseeing political affairs in key regions. He is a renowned author with over 300 publications to his credit. So on the topic of geopolitics and multilateralism, I don't think the organizers, NITI Aayog, could have found a better speaker than him to share his thoughts. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Nageswaran ji. Thank you, Dr. Berry. Friends, namaskar. As the leader of the G20 group of nations in this ongoing year, India tried to share its wisdom with the rest of the world. So let me begin my presentation also with one of the India's ancient beliefs about what we today call as global commons. Our ancient wisdom always stated that the creation was made of 5 elements. It contained 5 elements. We called them in Sanskrit as Prithivyapas Tejo Vayu Rakash. This is India's very ancient belief. It meant our earth, our oceans, our energy sources, our environment, and our space and outer space and cyberspace. We believed that these 5 elements constitute the entire creation, and hence they should be out of bounds for sovereign national governance. This has been the ancient thinking of this country. What we are calling as global commons today have always been held as for the benefit of entire humanity. So when we created the global multilateral institutions, most successful ones after the Second World War, in the form of the United Nations and its many allied organizations, the original focus should have been about these 5 elements. It has been, I'm not denying that. But as my previous speakers also directly, indirectly mentioned, the effort has not been so very successful. For various reasons. One reason one can attribute it to probably the bipolar Cold War politics in the initial 3-4 decades. But subsequently, in the last 2-3 decades also, what we see is the general perception, which reflected in the comments of my previous speakers also, that the multilateral institutions that we created are not able to deliver what is expected on issues like global commons. In fact, on many issues, but since our focus is on global commons, on that they are unable to deliver fully. Hence, India also maintained this position that probably a time has come for us to now think about a complete overhaul or restructuring of these institutions. One important reason I believe are an argument in favor of restructuring of these multilateral institutions that we created is because from a bipolar polity, we moved to a multipolar setup today, a world order today. I would probably go one step further to say that we are not even a multipolar world. We are a heteropolar world today. Multipolarity as a reality needs to be acknowledged because there is no one or two countries that would finally determine the destiny of all the countries of the world. There are many, many powerful countries emerged in different parts of the world. Many minilaterals have emerged. We are a part of SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We are a part of BRICS. There is one ASEAN. There are other groupings. These minilaterals also have emerged as important poles in the world. Besides this multipolarity and emergence of minilaterals, we today see the rise of big tech, rise of multinational economic corporations, rise of global NGOs. And of course, there are organizations, there are terror groups, there are religious organizations. All of them defy your national boundaries. For them, national sovereignty means nothing. Our internet is no longer, it's very difficult. You have to be a China to control internet or cyberspace. So we are living in a totally different kind of world order, a heteropolar world order. This has to be acknowledged as a reality today. I see some kind of resistance to this idea. No, we are still led by so and so, led by so and so. So here the question of when it's a multipolar world, how do you protect or attend to the aspirations of all the different countries in the world? Is it up to the United Nations to be able to do that? Or we need to have a totally different approach to this whole issue of global governance is an important issue to take up for discussion. That is where India's championing of the cause of global South becomes important. This global South, as we all know, consists of countries which are developing in nature. We used to call them the developing world. We are calling it global South. But 80% of the world's population, that means so-called global commons will be positively and negatively affected by these countries. Majority of these countries, for example, countries in Africa, are small island developing states, SIDS. They depend for their survival on what we call as global commons. You cannot deny them access to them. So the challenge is how do you lead this whole global South and its aspirations to grow? Here, India wants to take the lead. Essentially, global South are the minilaterals that have emerged in many parts of the world, have to be accommodated in any new structure that we build for future global governance. Any future United Nations should not be just a body of 195 or 97 countries alone. It should be able to represent the aspirations of this heteropolar world order. So that is where probably India's leadership of Global South will lead us. I will just leave 3 issues before you for consideration when we try to rebuild the multipolar order, heteropolar order for our future multilateralism. Number one, as I said, how can we make these heteropolar components a part of our future multilateralism? Second, Global South is a developing world. As I said, it depends on the so-called global commons, especially the oceans, the energy sources, the earth, for its survival. Now, suddenly we cannot say, no, you cannot access them. Or suddenly you have to reduce your emissions. Of course, they all have to come on board and do their bit. But is it at the cost of their aspirations to develop? Do we want those countries to remain underdeveloped or developing? Because I know about India for the last 3 decades, we are being called only as a developing country. It has been almost 3 decades now. So our Prime Minister wants India to be called a developed country 20 years from now. But that aspiration of the countries to become developed countries requires dependence on the very same resources which we are calling as global commons. How do we compensate if we want them to reduce their dependence on these commons? How do we compensate? Are we willing? Are those who have developed, who have progressed, willing to shell some pounds, some dollars for that purpose? And last, but I consider it as the most important, is how do we bring social sciences and natural sciences together? Now, social sciences take a direction. When I say social sciences, our economics, our education, our technology, our politics, they take a direction. But natural sciences has a different focus. How do we bring these two together? Every economic activity that we undertake from here, from this point, how is it going to be aligned with our nature, our environment, our panchabhutas, our global commons? In the age of artificial intelligence, how do we marry these two things? Is going to be a big, big question before all of us in the next 20 to 30 years, I believe. So friends, I will end by saying that the need for a new or renewed or revised multilateralism has been emphasized by all of us, but that new multilateralism cannot be just that of a few, again, the countries of the world led by someone. It has to take into account the current heteropolar reality and aspirations of the global south. More importantly, thank you. I will end here.
Yes, I've lived too long in the United States and am familiar with calls for people to give up their seats in an overbooked flight. So I made an error of judgment. I thought we had enough space at the table for the famous 40, but now I see Ashima's at the end. So I would request Samiran or Rana, whatever, to make space for Ashima so that she can be part of the first group. Yes?
So she went for the AC.
Yeah. Oh, okay, fine. So, okay. And are we expecting others also, or are we more or less okay? We're okay, fine. So, since our chair was not here yesterday, we are into the round of discussions amongst the round table. I'm happy to recognize people for you. I think Sujit Bhalla was first and then Tao Jung.
Yeah. I just want to make 2 points. First, that I completely agree with Mr. Orkhan that the SDG, multiple indicators, multiple goals, etc., are not very meaningful, except for a small group of academic bureaucrats who prolong their jobs and their activity. And some of it will come out in my session next. So that part I completely agree with. What I don't agree with is the example of COVID-19 and the international experience and how that is a a good indicator of policy or what happened. And I'll give 3 examples of why it's a terrible example of international cooperation and on health and movement from the global north to the global south. At the time of COVID-19, I was at the IMF and I wrote a paper on it, and which is why I claim the contents of that paper are as follows, of some of the important. First, on the permanent impact of the health shock. And the IMF and the WEO came out, or certainly this was part of the IMF, Article 4 and so on and so forth, that there was a 12%, their method, the IMF method of estimating the permanent shock to India was a 12% permanent gap. That very same method had a 1% permanent gap for China, and a 3% permanent gap for China, and a 1% positive gap for the US. Okay. So later events turned out to not suggest that that is the case. Second, the WEO claimed of 2021 that short, quick, and severe lockdowns actually helped in terms of prevention of a lower order of deaths and incidents of disease, and which has also turned out to be manifestly wrong. The third, and this was the entire, so I think this whole COVID-19 international experience, apart from SIR methods and coming out with estimates of 7 trillion deaths and so on and so forth. Not that deaths did not happen, don't get me wrong. And large amounts of deaths happened. The question is, did we follow, did the world follow? Did the global commons follow the correct policy with the lockdowns, etc.? And one of the major elements, including from the World Bank and the IMF and papers written, was the example of Sweden, which did not follow the lockdown approach, and there were articles galore about excess deaths in Sweden because they did not follow. And as it turns out, the very same institutions, the very same articles, the very same magazines like Lancet, etc., who were leading the charge, have now published articles saying that excess deaths in Sweden were amongst the lowest in the world, if not the lowest. So I think all of us, the global commons, have to re-examine the role of institutions, in particular with the dissemination of, let me say, misinformation about COVID-19. Thank you. Misinformation about the effects, possible effects of COVID-19. COVID-19 happened, the largest amount of deaths ever since the Spanish flu. So it's just, I think the question is, could these deaths have been a lot lower if the global commons had followed the right policies, which we may not have known. I'll just make one more point. Never before in the entire world, for centuries, for 7, 8 centuries, etc., was a lockdown advocated or practiced. There were local lockdowns, but not a national lockdown and not a global lockdown. And US had one of the most severe flus in 57, 58, where a lot of more excess deaths during the 6 months of that flu than during COVID, and they did not practice a lockdown. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujit. We have 3 more speakers who have wanted to share their remarks. First, I call upon Dr. Ashima Goyal to share her comments, questions.
Yeah, thank you. Again, a very interesting panel. Following from yesterday, we had some discussion on this geopolitics and global commons. So I think at this stage, we need to kind of focus on how to bring everyone on board to select policies that all nations in G20 can support. And one of the themes that was dominant yesterday was MDBs and making them do more, providing more finance for emerging markets. And Homi underlined the importance of increasing financing. All countries, all shareholders must increase financing for MDBs. But one issue that was not discussed was the governance issue. Some big countries are not willing to increase financing because they don't have the votes. And since they're not being given the votes, others, it's proportional increase in financing. Their financing is also restrained. So I was wondering if one way around this was that now we have an MDB system. We have MDBs where there are non-G7 countries. So if you look at the aggregate financing across the MDB system and you allow some countries to finance wherever they want to, and there's competition among MDBs to get this finance, so they improve their policies. I wonder if that is a way to sort of increase financing for MDBs. That is the first point I wanted to make. And similarly for debt restructuring, initially, I think China has withdrawn that position, but initially they were saying that they wanted the MDBs also to take a cut, the Bretton Woods institutions, before they would consider a cut and restructuring. But again, the point is that there are MDBs where they are the dominant financiers and they don't take a cut either, so they need not sort of then stand on that position. And finally, where Jean-Louis Arcand was, it's really tragic, the story of all the deaths, not only in Africa, many developing countries, many poor nations, but for the global system, I think, and for response from the major countries, the problem is that these are not systemic for the global, for their own economies. But now when we are talking about green and sustainable growth, when we are talking about growth, then we know that more than 50% of global growth comes from emerging markets now. And growth is valuable. So we know that the US Fed, for example, says its mandate is its own economy, its own inflation and growth. But there are spillovers from the global south to the north now. The spillovers are not only in growth, they are in excess migration, many other issues. And so it is in the interest of the global north to help maintain growth and reduce spillovers to the global south. Thank you. And Suman, thank you for asking me to shift. But I was sitting just under the AC vent and it was hitting my head, so I thought I'd sit. Yeah?
I am proud that this has been, I think, a gender-sensitive session, so I didn't want there to be any misunderstanding. I mean, conference, not session, but conference. Yeah.
Thank you, Ashima. In fact, it's good that you brought up the issue of spillovers. In fact, I was just wondering, in the audience, there was Surjit and yourself and Samiran, who are all also part of the financial markets / economic policy making. So the whole question of whether financial markets also constitute global commons, and that can be brought up in case, and Samiran has some comments to make. So I now offer the floor to Mr. Tower Zhang from the BIS to share his thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and of course, congratulations to all the three panelists for the very interesting presentations. And yesterday we discussed about the global financial safety net. We normally, as Suji, we work at the IMF. We said it's centered around IMF, etc. So obviously, global financial stability is a global commons, and still rightly so. And thanks to Jean-Louis, you mentioned another global public goods or commons, which is the health vulnerabilities. But we have a WHO, but you mentioned the insurance and the financings, but how to combine the two parts of the world, health and finance, bring them together to make sure the health vulnerabilities or stability, in the sense, if you borrow in the financial world, how to make them work together at the global level in terms of the global institution. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very succinct. And in fact, along with financial markets, whether global financial stability is also a global common. If so, how do we go about ensuring that? What kind of an institution do we need if one has to be created? I think those are all the questions that your remarks throw up. Thank you very much. I now call upon Mr. Peter Drysdale to share his thoughts.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I want to address my comments and questions to Mari Pangetsu and frame them in the context of Suman's original remarks about India's strategic choices, because I think this discussion is very relevant to how you think about the strategic choices that India makes over the next 10, 20, 25, 30 years. And relate this back to some of the discussion we had yesterday about globalization, the fading faith in globalization to some extent. And the three elements of that, really. The first element, of course, is concerns about the maldistribution of the gains from globalization, both internationally and domestically. The domestic issue was taken up by Robert Lawrence in his comments about what had happened in the United States, essentially because of the inadequacy of the transfer and welfare system in the United States. You've had the capacity to popularize anti-globalization policies and play into the political process that's taken over the agenda in the US approach to the international economy. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the international dimension of it was the theme that was reflected in yesterday's discussion about all the gains from globalization having been derived by China. Coming from where I come on the Pacific side of the Indo-Pacific, that's a pretty funny story, actually, because whilst much of the gain from globalization has come to China, of course, the 30% of the rest of the world economy that's in the Pacific has benefited greatly from globalization, and surely their customers in the rest of the world have benefited greatly from it too, including those in the United States, despite the shift in the gains from globalization in the United States towards capital, as you'd naturally expect. That's what you do about the distribution of that that's important. So that's the first thing that colours the discussion of this issue. The second thing that colours the discussion of this issue is the slowing of growth, which is in part a consequence, an endogenous process, part of consequence of the retreat from globalisation, protectionism, and all the rest of it. And that leads countries like India in particular to think about lack of opportunity for international orientation in growth strategy, a retreat from externally oriented growth, East Asian style, if you like, or Pacific style. And that's an issue that colours the discussion here. And the third issue, of course, is the retreat from US leadership of the system, and therefore the collapse of the global public good, or the threat to the global public good that sustains the rules that are so important to the management of the system. And that's an issue. That's an issue because who leads next? And this is a set of issues that Mari has addressed. Coming back to the Indian thing, and I want to put it to Suman as well as Mari. In the discussion here, and in your framing of it, Suman, I see strong hints of the response to this along three lines. The first response, of course, is the pull, because of worries about engagement in the international economy effectively with a slowing trade and economic growth, towards import substitution policies, domestically oriented growth and development policies that aren't built primarily on the claim for the capacity for Indian competitiveness in industrial manufacturing and so on. And that's a pull that's been endemic in the responses of many countries in India's situation over decades. And the justification of that we need to think about. But let me just say one thing about that. First of all, I know of no country in my lifetime that's made the tradition from low income to middle income through to advanced income that hasn't entered slow-growing global markets. All the growth of those countries in our region has been built on supply-driven growth, taking over other people's market shares in slow-growing markets. Secondly, I know of no country that has made the successful transition through low, middle to advanced income that's built its strategy on import substitution policies. So these are considerations that you need to take into account. And third, of course, we do rely, importantly, in engineering the transitions that have been engineered in my lifetime around this process to a regime that roughly holds together. Now, as Mari says, and this is where some critical focus should be, and this is my question to Mari, the multilateral system is still there, it still holds together, despite the retreat of US leadership, despite active attempts by the United States to undermine it through retreat from the dispute settlement system in the WTO. There's been a workaround of that with Canada, Europe, us, China. That's been an essential part of our settlement or our move to settlement for the Australia-China problem. Without that system, we would have incurred great losses through that dispute, but that system cushioned us against the costs of those kinds of disputes in the international system. So the system is still there, and it's begging for leadership that's plural. And this is where, and I like the plea for multipolarity, heteropolarity that Ram made, but this is where India's faith in multipolarity is going to be so important to what choices India makes about not only its international diplomacy, but also its international economic strategy. India's in a sweet spot, obviously, as was said yesterday, a sweet spot geopolitically, a sweet spot economically, but one has to be very careful not to be intoxicated by the sweetness of the spot you're in, and remain sober about the hard choices there are to be made about aligning domestic policies with international policies that allow the sort of transformation to be made that will see India move along the trajectory that clearly its leadership wants it to move.
Thank you very much, Mr. Drysdale. I think those were very pertinent and relevant to us and for the rest of the G20 as well. Now I call upon Mr. Manjeev Singh Puri to share his thoughts.
Thank you very much, Nageswaran. I must say, yet another fantastic panel, and thank you very much for putting this together. Jean-Louis, without doubt, what you highlighted about health, pandemics, growth, etc., it moves, and it's a matter that we must pay attention. But the comments I want to make and the direction of what I want to say is mostly directed at Ms. Mari Pangetsu. And I must say we are very fortunate to have somebody who has served as a minister in a major country in an issue of globalization, trade, and has served at one of the highest positions in the multilateral system as the managing director of the World Bank. And so we should try and understand from her what exactly is possible in terms of reform, reinvigorate. You can use whatever word that we want. I am in favor of incrementalism. I don't think we are at a point where you can tear up and move aside, etc. And I don't think incrementalism does not favor my country. I think it does. I want to point people to that wonderful slide which was put up, which Goldman Sachs, the analysis that they've done of the trajectories of global GDP, and let's leave this PPP out, without getting into a discussion. Let's look at nominal GDP. And you will know why for India, incrementalism is not a bad idea. It's in fact the methodology which will get you wherever. Let's also remember, we are talking about nation states and we are talking about hegemony, and the G20, etc. is nothing other than that. It's actually the backroom before the de jure discussions in the open center. It happens all over the UN. It happens at all multilateral forums. It happened at Versailles also, sir. It happened in San Francisco also. That's the nature of the game. It's just a more formalized thing. And I liked your expression, Ms. Mari Pangetsu, that over time after having fulfilled a goal of 2008, 2009, it became a communique issuing situation. Must change. Will it change today? I don't know. But I hope Indonesia, India, Brazil, South Africa can bring about the change along with another fundamental change. The change that happened in the United States, because otherwise for 4 years, we generally had hiatus on global cooperation, multilateralism, etc., etc. My question to you really is, what exactly can be done in somewhat concrete terms, in terms of reform of the structures of multilateralism, but more particularly the bank and the fund, because that's our kind of cooperation. Remember that even today, the G7 is more than 50% of global GDP. So while yesterday we were talking about Europe getting a hit and globalization having finished them, that's not really true in terms of money and where things are. And so when we look at all this, it's very good to make the demands, but the demands have responsibilities and you have to heave those. Is that really possible? So I'd like to hear from you. I also want to hear from you something much more direct. The issue of the governance at the World Bank is coming up for discussion within a year or two. What are we going to do? Because there is a very simple matter, that of who has the voting powers and how much should the change be. And I don't expect the United States to do anything about it, but how are you going to give place to the other demandeur, which is in a sense the elephant in this room? How are you not going to give in to that demandeur, and what is it going to mean for all of us? And how do we, Madam, India, Indonesia, how do we play our cards? And that's something perhaps we can learn a little bit from you. It's not just about global governance. Mr. Nageswaran, before I shut, I just want to say one little thing about SDGs. Sir, it has almost happened by design. 247, 139, etc. You know what the situation there was, and I happen to have been part of all these processes. What the situation in 28, 29, 2010, 2011, as the MDGs came to an end, and the idea of next round was happening at the UN. I'm sorry if you don't mind, sir, the goal number 1 of the SDGs continues to remain poverty alleviation, which, as you know, in those days, now we don't talk about it, was code word for the growth of China. Nobody was much interested in us, etc. Today they would be interested in India too. Largest country in the world makes a perceptual change in time. Certainly going to be the 3rd largest economy, no matter what happens. Because demographics, as Professor Paul Simon pointed out yesterday, has taken over. And modern globalization has, in a sense, flattened the world. In this kind of circumstance, to retain that particular thing there, that's why health, education, etc. came there. Otherwise, given what the powers that be on the other side of the Atlantic and on both sides of the Atlantic wanted, we would have had a 1-point SDG, and you know what it would have stood for. So let's understand that this is also global politics, and global economics informs global politics. There's no doubt about that. But possibly
Sir, we have 2 more speakers to ask questions,
Please.
so sorry to interrupt you. Thank you for all your very well-considered questions and points. Thank you so much. I now invite Mr. Paul Sampson to speak, followed by Mr. B.V.S. Subramanian.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists, an excellent panel, and much appreciated all of those comments. I want to maybe ask a question and then start to answer it as part of the conversation that we're going to have over the rest of today. In a way, it's already been said in different ways, but a summary of the question before us is how to reboot multilateralism in a multipolar world, or variations thereof, in a time of hot geopolitics. That is probably an unprecedented situation, certainly in historical record. And I think there are three parts to this that I would like to note here. First one is focusing on a core set of global commons questions and global interests. There probably hasn't been enough said about the interests part of it, right? Which is important here. And I think that list, we can debate what's on it. You know, we've heard climate change, financial stability, and debt. Completely agree. I think there's a basket of technology issues, artificial intelligence. I would put biotechnology there. I would put space there. And I think those are both global commons issues, and then there's a common interest. Point two is that we heard the case about the economic and human costs of decoupling very articulately from the minister, the rational case. But that is not enough to convince the political conversations that see things as zero-sum. So they take those economic arguments as a partial reason to take notice, but it's not enough. You have to go beyond and show a direct self-interest, which is why I'm emphasizing that point of the national interest embedded within the global commons. Not, you know, it's a small slice of those issues. It's not the whole range. That is the opposite of the SDGs, unfortunately. So it means, and the final point I would make is, and this perhaps comes more to where we're going this afternoon, what can India do about it? I think India can help frame that global commons and national interests conversation, and perhaps position this for the next couple of G20 presidencies. You know, it's been noted by several that the importance of it being India, Brazil, and South Africa is very important here, right? This only happens, these cycles don't happen often. There's 20 countries, or maybe even more, soon. This is the time to do it. So I think perhaps India to propose a list of global commons and global interest issues for work at the leaders level, you know, in the coming years, with a global South perspective being prominent there. And I'll leave it at that for now, but perhaps come back to some of these issues later today.
Thank you. Mr. B.V. Subramanian, please.
Thank you, Chair. I was tickled by the interesting way the global order was described by Mr. Madhav. You know, talked about individual nations, multilaterals, but then we create new word, minilaterals, with regional things or smaller groupings. But two other additional points which you mentioned, which is multinational corporations and global NGOs, and in terms of weight, size, and importance, they outweigh many countries in the world. And they don't seem to be engaged formally in any of the international bodies in terms of being part of the discussion. I mean, the Googles, the Microsoft, the Apples, the Teslas. I mean, in terms of deciding economic trajectories of the world, or at least for many countries, are actually important. And so goes for many NGOs. And a lot of them are actually spin-off of these founders of a lot of these companies. So, I mean, there's just a thought, a rhetorical one. Is there some way of actually involving them in a more formal way in which they also contribute to all these discussions and also be part of the decision-making thing? I mean, why can't they be in the UN formally if you have some threshold, or in some other system? I think that's one thing. Second, a larger issue, because the topic was multilateralism and, you know, the whole thing, and the panelists made different takes on that. The multilateralism lives on rule-based orders. It's good, because we all like rules. We think rules bring discipline. But the problem with rules is they are locked in time. And they're locked in certain economic orders and certain economic systems. And these rules, unlike rules which are domestic, which evolve because many countries are democratic, and they evolve with time, and they adjust to new technologies, new economic systems, new economic orders. These global things, because they in any case come through with such difficulty, are not flexible enough to adjust for technology, for growth, for changing global systems. So how do we have a global order which has a flexible rule-based system, which has inbuilt ways of evolving? I mean, can they have expiry dates? I mean, I see the discussions, for example, in the WTO on the e-commerce moratorium, which has inbuilt expiries. It has not expired. Every time it is extended, but the discussion keeps it alive till the end and forces adjustment. And that forcing adjustment is how things happen. So this debate at the World Bank, or the debate somewhere else, the UN Security Council, they are very tough debates because who is locked in, we like to keep the others locked out. So the question is, can we think of new interesting ways of actually structuring global organization?
Thank you, BVRS. We may have run out of time for further comments, but we may have time for questions. In the sense that if there are, we have had the center speak, we have the periphery over there in the development literature. So we have to be inclusive. But unfortunately, as usual, the periphery always gets the short treatment. Therefore, I have to ask you to have very specific, snappy questions if you have, rather than make comments to the panelists.
Thank you, Chair. Building on off of the CEO's question there to Mr. Madhav ji, on heteropolarity, one of the ways in which that has been done is by devolution of powers to private consortiums and scientific consortiums and regulatory bodies. Is that the way to go?
Are there any other questions from anyone? Okay. I'm going to invite the expert commentator, Dr. Ramesh Chand, to share his thoughts before we ask the panelists for their closing remarks.
Thank you, Chair. Friends, I hope you will agree with me that we have a brilliant presentation by the panelists and equally brilliant coordination and comments by chair of the session, and very sharp questions have been raised, and I look forward to equally exciting answer session after my comments. I feel if we want to discuss or debate future of multilateralism, we need to go into development which happened in the post-WTO period. In the post-WTO period, there were two parallel movements. One was expansion of multilateralism, but simultaneously explosive growth in PTAs. You call them free trade agreement, regional trading agreements, but I find them neither free nor regional. Therefore, I am using the term preferential trading agreements. Up to 2007, when global financial crisis happened, these two movements just went in the same direction. But after 7-8, we find that multilateralism started weakening, fragmenting, but excitement among nations about preferential trading agreement, it remains strong, and that growth in fact continues. I feel based on this experience, we need to clearly draw what are the core areas for multilateralism, which cannot be dealt by PTAs. We know it. If we want to address effect of subsidies in fishery, on fishery, we know it cannot be addressed through PTA or regional trading agreement. We have to go to this multilateralism. But I feel it is very important to know whether growth of PTAs has in some way adversely affected this multilateralism. The old debate, Jagdish Bhagwati versus other, whether RTAs are building block or stumbling block for multilateralism. I feel we need to draw some lessons for that, and what are the core areas for multilateralism. that will help in building strong argument in favor of multilateralism. Then second is that yesterday and also today some reference was made toward from globalization to slowization, that the slowness, slowing down in fragmentation in multilateralism. I feel there we need a little more nuances, because when we talk of multilateralism, broadly the issues can be divided in three categories. One category is issue related to economy, issues related to trade, bank, fiscal, those kind of things. And second is issues which are related to humanitarian aspects, health, nutrition, food security. And in the third category comes issues which relate to survival of people and planet, climate change, sustainability, environment, biodiversity. I feel the presentation which were made yesterday, that fragmentation of multilateralism, weakening of multilateralism, that applies to my mind for the issues in category 1. As far as issues in category 2 and 3 is concerned, I find that the global mechanisms to address that are getting stronger. SDG, whatever it is, what you just find after MDG, we brought SDG, even SDG limitation we are discussing through food system transformations, and lot of interest, decarbonization and how we do it. So I think we should not sweep it with brush that multilateralism everywhere is becoming fragmented or weakened. Yes, in the area of trade and economy that is happening, but in the other areas, this trend toward multilateralism, I find is rising. Then second is that again it is diagnosis is very important. Diagnosis about slowing down or fragmentation of multilateralism. To what extent it was because of slowing down of global growth in global economy? To what extent it is due to policy decision taken by different countries? That distinction is very, very important. I looked at some of the data, like if we look at trade intensity or share of ratio of export to GDP, since World War II till 2007, it has been increasing, and the peak was reached at 67% in year 2007. Then global financial crisis happened. It dropped suddenly from 67 to 52%. But after that, it stabilized around 54%. We did not see a decline in the subsequent 15-year period, but it is fluctuating around that 54%. So is it that after global financial crisis, the global growth in global economy did not recover, and that is the reason for it? Or the reasons are more policy induced, like Brexit, trade restriction, etc. I think there is a need for strong empirical work to understand it. Also, I saw one IMF study which just says that the effect of mild fragmentation on global economy will be a reduction in GDP, global GDP by 0.2%, but in case of severe fragmentation, it can go up to 7%, but if you take into account the other channels through which the effect percolate down, then it becomes much more serious. Another issue which I want to share is that many developing countries, they agree to be member of WTO despite a lot of opposition at domestic level. But I think after some time the frustration started that the field is not leveled, they are not able to have say in this, and WTO stalemate, etc. And I think that also need to be factored in, that because of whether the stalemate in WTO is one of the reasons for a reduced interest in multilateralism. I will quickly make 2 points because time is already up. One big change which is happening in global economy, and from there I want to link it to my area, which is agriculture. The structural change of economy which was happening as per the Arthur Lewis hypothesis, that as economies grow, share of agriculture in GDP declines, that again stopped after 2005. Up to 2005, from 70 to 2005, share of agriculture in global economy, global to GDP, declined from 10% to 3.2%. But after 2005, share of agriculture, rather than declining, increased by 33%. From 3.2%, it went up to 4.4%. I feel this has very, very serious implication for development policy, for trade, even for multilateralism, even for climate change and other kind of things. I keep discussing these things with our vice chairman, CEO and other things to reimagine agriculture, its role in development, etc., etc. But I think it has serious implication. The most serious is for employment, because manufacturing growth has slowed down. Manufacturing is going for capital intensive production. The labor shift from agriculture to non-agriculture has either halted or it is very, very slow and is a matter of concern. The last point is, in fact, we made this presentation. Somebody mentioned about G20 having so many SDGs. India made from NITI Aayog side one presentation to meeting of agriculture ministers, where we pointed out that the most serious issues in agri-food sector is that after 2010, the hunger and undernutrition in the world has started increasing. That increase, reversal started in hunger and nutrition improvement around 2010, first in Africa, then it spread to South America. Of late, it has hit South Asia also. And what is more tragic is that hunger and undernutrition have started deteriorating, despite the fact that agriculture growth is intact, per capita food production is rising. So these things, I think, again, need to be taken into consideration. They are why I mentioned these things, not only for sake of agriculture, because they are related to how the technology transfer happened from developed country, from north to south. That fact, cost of production, so many other kind of things. So I think that is another issue. And I just very interesting last comment, presentation by Madhav ji as usual. But I feel that in case of global common, he was alluding to global common which are existing, like our oceans, forest, biodiversity. They are existing, and what kind of livelihood, sustainability issue related to them, that is one set of issue. I think in multilateral forum, we are more concerned about global common which we want to create, like decarbonization, sustainability, those kind of issues. So I had some other issues also, but respecting time, I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramesh ji, for your expert comments, and especially about the data on agriculture share of GDP going up globally, which is, I think, is probably a good thing in the current context. Now, we have already overshot the schedule close by 5 minutes, but I still want to have the panelists respond to many interesting and important observations made by the group here. So over to start with Ms. Marie Pangetsu for her comments, and then followed by Jean-Louis, and then followed by Mr. Madhav ji.
Thank you very much to everybody for a very rich discussion and questions. I don't think I can answer every question, but I did want to take up some of the questions. I think the question on the how much can we get on the MDB reforms, let me give a crack. I think both Ashima and Ambassador Puri asked this question. I don't have a good answer, but I can give you my own insight. I think what Homi presented yesterday was quite well accepted now, that we need scale, we need urgency of the resources on climate and development. And I think after a long debate where G7 was, climate, I think the global south, if you like, within the World Bank, in terms of the shareholders, really fought back to make sure that it's development, it's integrated. Climate is integrated with development, or development is, you have to have development first and then climate. So I think that is now well accepted. And I do think that's a good win for the South. But what needs to be done and where the money is going to come from, where the technology is going to come from, I think that's really where it comes out to. So, Homi made a number of suggestions yesterday. And I think one, he made a very strong recommendation that the Global South needs to now be very proactive and make a very strong voice in terms of the importance of the MDBs in delivering not just the 100 billion, but the MDBs need to deliver on the scale. And he mentioned something about the MDBs working together, right? And here's where I think, again, I wanted to make this point yesterday, but the country platform model of countries. So developing countries and the Global South need to be very proactive also in determining what and where the money goes to, right? Apart from the streamlining and so on, and the kind of conditions that come out. And that has to come from the developing countries themselves. And I think G20 actually can play a role here. This is a very complex issue, like energy transition. But yesterday there were a few good discussions. You can take this energy transition platform, this JETP, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, I think it's called. Originally, it was very G7 driven, and then countries starting with South Africa and then Indonesia and then India, even though you don't have a JETP, we push back, right? Saying this is not, it's top down. So now it's more bottom up. And I think we can share our experience as to how we negotiate the terms and the types of things that we need to get done. And I think, Hanan, you mentioned yesterday, for Africa, it's not transition, it's access. So these are the issues that are very important. And it's not just about mitigation, it's about adaptation. Things like that needs to come from the Global South, and even including loss and damage. How do you put a number to loss and damage? Where did this 100 billion come from? I think this is where the Global South needs to also play a role in being proactive and defining, okay, we want not just wanting the money, but where does the money go to? And it's not just money, it's technology, and it's the platform of structuring this blended finance, for want of a better term. And it does have to be centered around countries. And I'm also arguing for regions, because like energy, it should be could be a regional project, et cetera, et cetera. So that's some of the issues with regard to MDB reforms. And the elephant in the room, the shareholding rights, I think you mentioned it also, Ashima. I'm very pessimistic that you will see any change in the voting rights anytime soon. But what will happen, or trying to happen, is apart from the optimization of the balance sheet, they are trying to have a global public goods fund that will be the additional, it has to be a delta that will address the climate and development. Now, how that's governed, that's where we need to have a big voice, right? First, I think it shouldn't be a trust fund. Trust fund is $1 in, $1 out. It should also be structured with leveraging so that you get more bang of the buck. Second, who determines where that money goes? Not just the donors, but also the recipients. And this is where private sector and NGOs can be part of the governing board of where that money goes. And I just wanted to give a G20 example where this governance has happened in two instances. One is the Food Security Fund that came out after the 2008 food security issue. There was a fund, and the governance is exactly that: donor, recipient, and stakeholders. Pandemic fund has the similar structure. So they're small, but so the Global Public Goods Fund is going to be big. And this is where maybe I'm running out of time. I wanted to just very quickly to Peter's point about reminding us that yes, there's defraying and dysfunctioning, but the multilateral trading system is still there. And we don't, it's not about coming up with a new multilateral trading system, but making the current one work as well as it can. And you know, some of these plurilateral or club of clubs incremental approaches to addressing the dispute settlement issue should still continue, while the first best may be to fix the dispute settlement. And I think you mentioned about, you know, the rules need to be updated. Yes, totally agree. But the principles of transparency, predictability, non-discrimination, and national treatment and recognizing the development needs are still relevant. So let me stop there.
Luis, for any comments or?
Just 2 points. The 2 points that I was trying to make was, first of all, just about every culture in the world has some kind of, you know, when you wish someone well, I don't know, a Brazilian version, at least in Bahia, is amor, dinheiro e a saúde para aproveitar. So love, money, and the health to be able to enjoy the first two. So let's make sure we take the health into account. And the second point is just simply the poorest countries in the world, you know, for lack of a better term, let's say LDCs, are vulnerable, and it isn't just health. I mean, climate, that's something that comes up all the time in terms of the LDCs or you know, or small island nations. There's, you know, various groupings that there are. And, you know, let's just keep that on the G20 agenda, please.
Very much for keeping it brief. Over to you.
For any future multilateralism to work in the 21st century, firstly, the 20th century multilateral institutions have become irrelevant in 21st century. So for them to work, I have 2-3 suggestions. One, future multilateral institutions should not have provision for permanent membership and veto. Do away with that. Allow for these plurilateral or minilateral bodies to become a part of the multilateral structure, assign some responsibilities, for example, tackling terrorism. Give it to, make it the responsibility of these minilaterals, or plurilateral bodies. At some level, involve the other heteropolar stakeholders, whether it is the industry, big tech, or it is NGOs, or it is religious organizations. I am surprised that in the entire UNESCO system, there is no role for religion, culture, or social bodies. It's only bureaucrats who decide about the education culture of the entire world. It's called scientific, educational, cultural organization, but no role for any cultural or religious leader in that. Why can't it be? Why can't we expand it to include those people also, even including SDGs? I agree with Ramesh, but you know, all these sustainability, food sufficiency, all are derivatives of our core concern about the global commons. For them to be delivered also, these heteropolar institutions can be a big help for us. So they should also find place in our future multilateral mechanism. If that can happen, that multilateral type of mechanism will be more useful for the 21st century reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. It has been a very involved, intense, and insightful discussion over the last 105 minutes. I believe that we are closer to solving some of the issues of multilateralism or arresting its decline at the end of it than we were at the beginning of it. And of course, it's also possible that bigger changes require bigger crises for people to rethink their modes of operation. So, but with your permission, let us all put our hands together to thank the panelists for a wonderful discussion. And we all have now earned our tea and snacks break. Thank you. And before you disperse, Suman has some comments.
There are very important points that Peter Drysdale made, but because I wanted to give enough time to the speakers, I won't take the time now. Just to say that the next session has a couple of virtual participants, and therefore delaying it by 15 minutes is perhaps the most license we could. So could I please ask people, Ramona or Anna, we need to return in 20 minutes, is it? 11:50? Could we? and something like that? Yeah. Huh? Sorry? Yes. So let's start the next session at 11:50 sharp. And Peter, I'll take up your comments bilaterally. Thank you.